Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, where we like to think that we bring you the very best content with regards looking at these old school vintage dirt bikes. Now, if you're a brand new subscriber to CDB TV, then welcome aboard, and I hope you continue to find more interesting machines to look at here on my YouTube channel. Now, coming up right now, this is a machine that I filmed just recently, and it's a very rare example of a British made bike with, of course, a Japanese four-stroke motor. And this particular machine is said to be only number 27 of less than 50 models that were actually built. So let's dive straight into that video now and take a look at John Porteous's 1977 Mark II Hagon Yamaha. Yes, so thanks once again for coming back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and as I said, only just recently I did manage to come across this superb specimen of a bike that was very radical for a 1970s off-road bike at the time when it first took to the track. But this featured machine here is yet another very rare classic from the John Porteous motorcycle collection. Although just before we get down to taking a look at the bike in detail, John asked me to tell you that he now wants to move this bike on to make way for some brand new bike projects. So if you think you may be in the market for a rare classic, or indeed a piece of motorcycling history to add to your collection, then why don't you just give John a bell on this number, and he'll supply you with all of the relevant details on the bike, and more importantly, the asking price. And so what we're actually looking at here is a 1977 Mark II Alf Hagon built four-stroke Yamaha that uses an all-alloy monocoque chassis. And this particular bike here is frame number 27 of around 50 bikes that were ever made. And of course, it also uses that TT Yamaha four-stroke motor to power it. Now, many off-road enthusiasts still believe that it was either Yamaha or Honda who were the very first manufacturers to invent a fully alloy frame on a motocross bike, when in actual fact the British built Greaves off-roaders from the early 1950s were already using a cast alloy downtube on their motocross bikes of that time. But we certainly all know that the world's first fully alloy scrambles bike chassis were made by British speedway and grass track racing legend, the great Alf Hagon. And these beautifully sculpted alloy frames were raced to great success in the 1970s by scramble star of the day, Vic Eastwood. Although it's probably suffice to say that when Alf Hagon built these all-alloy monocoque chassis, the motocross world had certainly never seen anything like them before. And when you take a look at the engineering and the skill and the time involved in constructing these alloy chassis, they're certainly without doubt a work of art in their own right, because all of the other chassis parts are included in just one single construction, and even the carburetor's airbox is also an integral part of the bike's frame, which again you can see has been superbly crafted, and it's all part of the singularity of this one-piece alloy chassis. And no matter which angle you view this Hagon chassis from, you just can't help but appreciate its ingenuity and its design. And I haven't a clue as to exactly what it weighs, although I'll wager that it's just a fraction of an equivalent steel chassis with a similar sized motor. Although without doubt this all alloy monocoque bike frame must have looked like something from another dimension when it was unveiled in the 1970s, when more or less all scrambles bikes of that time were still using those medieval steel chassis. But when you look at these frames, at first glance, it may look like this is just another fuel tank that's been bolted on to the all-alloy chassis. But this item, once again, is all part of the bike's single one-piece frame, which again is superbly made and an integral part of these very unique Hagon monocoque chassis. But certainly for innovation and design, these Hagon frames were simply years ahead of their time. Now naturally, Hagon are never going to fit an old school steel type swing arm to a machine of this stature, so they just designed and built their own alloy swing arms as well to fit onto the bike. And this unit once again would fit in perfectly with the all alloy structure of the machine, but more importantly it would also further reduce its overall weight, of which it was already a featherlight off-road motorcycle. But it's said that fewer than 50 of these Hagon chassis were actually made. Some were manufactured to house the big four-stroke Suzuki motors, while others, as in our case here, had the big TT500 Yamaha power plant. But they were all stamped with their individual serial numbers and of course the address of the bike's manufacturer. Okay, so as we move on to the power plant of our Mark II Hagon bike, as you can gather, it's powered by a mighty TT500 Yamaha 4-banger motor, which, as you're aware, were originally a road trail type of bike until owners then discovered just how good they were in terms of their reliability and their power, and it wasn't too long before they were then removing all of the road going bits on their bikes and using them as full-blown off-road race machines. Now, of course, a stock standard TT500 certainly hasn't got enough grunt for a top rider to get good results, and that's why our particular TT here has been doctored and put on an overdose of steroids to make sure that it has sufficient horses to get that job done. Now, starting at the top end, the motor has a replacement megacycle hot camshaft to make sure that those big valves open and close at the correct time and for the right amount of duration. And also to shed precious grams of weight from this motor, it's also undergone some surgery to have every second cooling fin machined off the cylinder, which I'm sure has absolutely nothing to do with the actual performance or running of the engine, but it's more than likely that it's been done just to further reduce the overall mass of the engine. But it certainly gives the motor a totally different look from its stock factory manufacture. Now, down below, the motor now sports an upgraded Carrillo conrod and the usual high compression piston as well, and also our TT engine has undergone a full rebore to take it from what was originally 499 cc's to what is now a much more respectable 540 cc. Now, on our Hagon TT540's transmission side, The stock standard 5-speed gearbox has been removed from this motor, and a much better user-friendly NEB 3-speed gearbox slotted in its place, which was actually a very common swap on these Hagon Yamahas back in the day, and obviously it led to less rider shifting on the track, and also it let the rider concentrate on riding the bike as quick as he could, rather than working out which actual gear that he was in. Now, to feed that Yamaha TT540 with its fuel, it's a relatively modern Mikuni carburetor that's been used to mix the fuel and air for the engine's explosions, and this of course draws its air through a modern style foam type air filter that's housed inside that nicely sculpted alloy airbox. And again, the engine is fitted with a big bore exhaust pipe, which is actually a 2-part unit that's been custom made to fit the Hagon chassis and work around that Yamaha 4-stroke motor. But there's certainly a decent bark from this big tailpipe when the engine on our Hagon Racer gets fired into life. And so as we move on to the bike's front suspension, which in our case here is actually a pair of 43mm forks borrowed from a Honda CR 125. Although if you know your Hagons, then you'll already know that many of these Hagons were actually fitted with American-made Simon's forks back in the day, which John says that he still has for this bike, but those Simon's forks were in need of a bit of a service and some maintenance, and so John bolted on these 125 Honda units until such times as that he gets round to completing that particular job. And again, as you can see, John's Hagon Yamaha's fitted with these old school antique twin leading shoe type drum brakes, which will still be good enough to slow down or stop our Hagon Yam, because after all, this isn't a big heavy machine, so these front drum brake stoppers will be more than adequate for that particular purpose. And it's really much the same story with this Yamaha rear brake, which again is still a drum and shoe type system, which you've got to expect on an off-road bike from the late 1970s, because we still didn't have things like modern hydraulic stoppers on off-road bikes at that time. But nevertheless, this was still the braking technology of its day, and more than adequate for our big Hagon Racer. And so as we move on to the back end of John's Hagon twin shock racer, it's a pair of period correct American made Fox air shocks, which once again were just a usual standard fitting on most of these alloy Hagon Yamahas and Suzukis back in the day. But as long as these shocks were working correctly and all set up properly, then these air-filled suspension units still did a very good job. But for sure, for a radical design of air suspension, originally conceived of course by Bob Fox in the early 1970s, these rear shocks are still being put to good use on many of the older twin shock bikes still racing today. Now, with regards this seat here on John's Hagon Yamaha, this is yet another part that's been custom made to fit onto that all alloy monocoque Hagon chassis, which as you'd expect is not going to accept a seat from just any old twin shock race bikes, so Hagon have done the next best thing, and that's to design and build their very own just to fit onto this quite radical chassis. Now, I'm certainly not saying that every single component here on John's Hagon Yamaha is the self-same part that was fitted to the bike in 1977, because these rental handlebars and their controls don't look like they belong in that era, although nonetheless you're certainly going to need a steady hand on this Swedish Gunnar Gasser twist grip to keep all of those Yamaha ponies in check when you turn on the gas. But again, another must-have item to fit onto these bars is that all-important engine decompressor lever, so that you can set up that big four-banger Yamaha engine in the correct configuration for starting the motor. But certainly this is another superb classic, and quite rare as well, as I mentioned, due to only around 50 of these machines ever being made, which of course had the combination of either the big Suzuki Fourstroke engines or these TT Yamahas inside the frame. But the great British racing legend Vic Eastwood certainly did ride, and he even helped develop these Hagon bikes, and that's why they still have these VE logos on the fuel tank to denote the great man's racing career, and of course to acknowledge his input in helping to develop these iconic race bikes. Although certainly without doubt these Hagon Yamahas are another piece of rare motocross history, and certainly a bike that you could keep for many years without any fear of rust developing on any of its parts, due of course to the copious amounts of alloy that's been used in the bike's construction. But it's also a machine that you just don't see on the racetracks in these modern days now, and I think there's only one other that I've seen in the last few years, which is another Hagon Yamaha that's still being raced by Lee Davis in the south of the country. And there's no question that this bike is going to make a very good addition to somebody's vintage dirt bike collection because of its limited numbers and of course the connection with Vic Eastwood and the design and build of that Alf Hagon alloy monocoque chassis. But as I mentioned, John's now decided to let the bike go to make way for more machines to add to his collection. So if you think that this is maybe something that you might be interested in, then why not just pick up that phone and call John on this number listed here, because these rare and exotic machines are only appreciating in value as the years tick by, and this particular Hagon Yamaha is a truly fine example of the kind of innovative engineering that was taking place in the design and build of off-road motorcycles in the late 1970s. Well, I hope you enjoyed taking that brief look around John Porteous's 1977 Mark II Hagon Yamaha, a bike, as I said, that's now being offered up for sale because John wants to make room to build up his collection of old vintage dirt bikes. So coming up next here on CDB TV, we're going to take a look at another quite rare machine, and this particular Italian stallion is a 1981 Ancelotti PSV 250, and this particular bike has just undergone a recent refurbishment, and it's actually got quite a good family story behind it as well. So we'll be taking a look at this lovely Ancelotti 250 when we return to CDB TV. But once again, thanks to everybody out there for subscribing and tuning in to my channel, and hope to see you back here again very soon so we can talk about more of these old school vintage classics right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV.